Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to the episode of Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series I'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible tabletop results without the premium price tag. And on today's episode, we're going to show you guys how to paint a regiment of White Lions of Thrace for your armies of High Elf realms for Warhammer the Old World. As you can see, this is the end result of what your miniatures will look like. We're going to bring it to a beautiful tabletop standard, and if you were to purchase everything that we recommend in this video for your cheapskate total, you're talking about a grand total investment of $48.88. Now, when you oppose that to the materials you need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel, that's going to cost you $254.59 for that. You end up with a total savings of $205.79. So before we even get this video started, let's talk about the design sequence I came up for this army. When it came to this regiment, I was trying to look for more of like an earthy kind of woodsman type of look with these guys, just because, like, you know, a lot of High Elf armies are painted with reds and in blues, which is perfectly fine, but these guys are supposed to be descended from woodsmen who actually live out on the frontiers of Thrace on Althawan, back in the Warhammer fantasy setting. And so you want something that, I want to look for more of a color scheme that kind of match that aesthetic, where these guys would be more in the woods type of stuff. So I want to have a little bit more earth tones with their armor, and I also want to give their accent color being green, so that way they can blend in with their environment. So with that being said, let's talk about how to paint these guys up cheaply and quickly. Now, the first thing you have to do with the miniatures, of course, is you got to assemble them. And of course, unfortunately, the instructions for these guys are actually quite poor. I will warn you guys that if you guys open up a box of White Lions from the new Warhammer the Old World, the instructions have very little instructions in terms of like letters and parts. It's just pictures. They don't really do a good job explaining what parts go to where. So my suggestion to you is to go online and look for an older set of instructions for White Lions of Thrace. That's what I did. I ended up going on and looking for the classical parts number instructions, and I use that to create these guys. So Games Workshop, you really need to take care of that quality control. Now, once you're done assembling the miniatures, the next thing to do, of course, is to texture the bases. Now, in order to do the texturing, you could buy a pot of astrogran to do this, but that's expensive, whereas cheap wood glue and sand is plentiful all over the place. So all I do is I take wood glue and I paint the part of the base that I want the texturing to be on, and then I dust it with some sand that I get from my backyard garden. I wait for that to dry, and then before you know it, you have a beautiful texturing on your bases. Now, once the texture is done drying, what you want to do now is, of course, to put a sealant on top of it, so that way it doesn't come flicking off the base. Now, for my sealant, I usually like to use a mixture of water as well as wood glue. I go for about a 50-50 mixture, and I make a slurry out of the wood glue and the water, and I apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the texturing, and I let it sit and dry. That way it creates an eye-tight sealant, well, basically will stop the bases from having the texture flake off the bases. So next we have to do, of course, is to magnetize our bases. Now, a lot of people like to use the rare earth metal type magnets that they get from Army Painter as well as from Army Painter. That's great and all, but the problem is that they're extremely expensive. What I like to use instead is I like to use magnetic vent covers that you get from your local hardware store. In fact, if you go to the hardware store to where their venting is located, you'll find these giant sheets. I believe they're like 6 inches by 12 inches. They're huge. These sheet magnets that you're supposed to put on vent covers for air conditioning units. So they come into this nice white background. They're also magnetized on the side. The best part about it, of course, is they're polarized correctly, so that way you can put them back to back and it's still magnetized. And they only cost $5.99 for 3 sheets of those things. So I buy that and I cut them into 20mm squares, and then I glue them to the bottom of the bases. So now that I put the sheet magnets on the bases, as you can see, some of it kind of overhangs a little bit on the base size, and that's perfectly fine. If that does happen, all you gotta do, of course, take a pair of scissors and trim them down, so that way they're flush with the bases, and now your bases of your miniatures are magnetized, and they didn't cost you very much money in order to do so. Now, the next step, of course, is to prime your miniatures. And for priming is an important step because what it does, it creates an adhesive surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to as you're painting your miniatures. Unfortunately, if you were just to take acrylic paint and put on bare plastic, it'd rub off with the slightest bit of friction. So the priming is a very important step for your miniature painting. The second thing that primer also does too is also has a large impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you put down on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the brighter or the more vibrant paint job you want to do, the brighter the primer you want to use. And so using a quick paint method, it's going to use the oil wash, is going to darken the value of our colors. I want the white primer on this one as well. I use Rust-Oleum flat white primer. You can visit your local Walmart. Now, if you'll notice, my miniatures are actually much larger than the original 20 white lines that we originally had. And the reason why that's the case is because I do have some older edition pewter miniatures from the 6th as well as the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy for High Elf Thracian white lines. So I decided to include them in this unit and paint them all at once. In fact, as we're going through this tutorial, I'll show you how I painted the old pewter miniatures as opposed to the modern plastic miniatures. So that way you can see how you could do both, because I know some people have the older ones out there and they're purchasing those to make their armies with. So the way I like to paint my miniatures, I like to paint my miniatures as if I was dressing them. I start with the flesh first and then work on the successive layers outwards. So the first thing we gotta take care of is the flesh. Now you'll notice I divided my miniatures between the modern plastic ones on the left hand side as well as the old pewter ones on the right hand side. And just to do that to show you guys the differences. For example, if you look at the ones on the left hand side, the newer sculpts, the only part of flesh that's exposed are their faces. Whereas in the old pewter range, it's both the hands as well as the faces. Now regardless of what type of miniature you're painting, you can paint them both two thin coats of flesh by Apple Barrel paint. You give that at your local Walmart. Just do a good solid base coat on both sides for two different coats for both groups. You're ready to move on. Now our next step, of course, is to do dry brushing. Now dry brushing is an important step to use in painting because it creates the illusion of death by creating highlighting on your miniatures. When you do dry brushing, the pigments of the paint adhere to the raised surface of the miniature while the darker color stays in the recesses, creating that illusion of depth. So for example, things like spaces and musculature on muscles and on flesh, folds of fabric, that sort of thing. Now for this one, I like to use Delta 7 coats, peaches, and creams. I just do a quick once over with the dry brushing on all the parts that are exposed in flesh, so that way you create that illusion of depth. Now when it comes to dry brushing, I always suggest that you start with a very light dry brushing first, because you can always add successive layers on dry brushing onto your miniatures, but it's very difficult to go back. So just dry brush your miniatures to the degree of brightness that you want, and you're ready to move on to our next detail. And the next detail we're going to take care of real quick are the leather goods, things like the gloves, for example, on the fighter's left-hand side, as well as everybody's boots. Now I'm using the exact same color for that detail, and that detail, of course, is pavement paint. I'm going to just put two thin coats directly on the gloves and boots on the plastic miniatures, as well as the boots of the pewter miniatures. And before we start dry brushing anything, the next thing I want to work on real fast is on the little the head statue of the white lion that came with the box set for the modern miniatures. Now the reason why I like using this miniature so much is because it is a placeholder miniature. It's supposed to be used to take the spot of another white lion. And the reason why is because just in case I want to include a character in this unit, I can do so. So that's the reason why I'm paying up this lion's head miniature, to take the spot of that character. Now for this color, I'm using two thin coats of pewter gray by Apple Barrel. You can get it at your local Walmart. And once you guys are done with that, dry brush all the materials that we did in pavement as well as in the pure gray that we did earlier. We're going to dry brush out some pale gray by Folkart. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's a nice pale gray color that's almost white, just a little bit darker than white. I also like to use it to do a lot of the white painting on these miniatures. I'll explain that process when we actually end up using it. So let's do the dry brushing real quick for all the parts that we did in pavement, and we're going to now work on the banner. So these next few slides are actually dedicated to the banner, and the reason why is because I want to get the banner taken care of first, because if I wait to want to work on it at the end, I might rush it. So I decided to take my time working on this banner because it's nicely sculpted. Now when it comes to my painting, I am horrible at painting straight lines. I just am. When it comes to edge highlighting or outlining things or using fine brushwork, I'm horrible at it. I just don't have the skill developed yet in order to make that level, and I'm fully aware of that for myself. So because of that, when it comes to sculpted things like this on banners, I do tend to struggle with it a little bit, so I tend to take my time on these and work on them first. That way I just kind of get that hard part taken care of. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to paint the banner green, and the reason why is because I want to match these guys to match up with the color scheme that I created for these guys about being them from the woods. So I painted the entire thing green, and then I used Chris Apple by Apple Barrel paint to do it. Now the next step, of course, is to dry brush the miniature. So I use Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel to dry brush it, to creating out that bas relief that's sculpted directly onto the banner. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. Originally, that was my entire plan to do this banner. I was just going to paint the entire thing green, dry brush it real quick, and then add some oil wash to it to make it look like it was stitched directly onto the banner. And I was going to move on because I do struggle with the finer details like this using fine line work when it comes to painting. The only problem, though, is that it didn't look right just having this bright green banner with, no details on it. So I listened to the little inner critic that was living in my head and decided, you know what, I am sure to paint the banner like I'm supposed to, which kind of complicates things a little bit for me, but that's okay. So in case you're unfamiliar with the White Lion's banner, what it is basically it's a mural. It shows a white lion walking across a green field with rolling hills in the background with a blue sky as well as a sun. So if I had decided to paint this like I was really supposed to paint it like I was supposed to, I would have started with the blue background, but I didn't because I was trying to be lazy when I was painting up this banner. But so that's why I said it kind of complicated things a little bit for me. Because if I was painting this in the traditional style, I would have started with the blue first, but I didn't do that because I was being lazy and I decided not to do that and to go back and fix it. So to create that blue sky effect, I used True Blue by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart. I just put two thin layers on both sides of the banner where the blue sky is located at, and as you can see now, you can definitely see the white lion. You can also see the rolling hills in the background as well. So the next detail I decided to paint out was on the white line itself. Now, this is where I like to use pale gray to do this. Now, when it comes to painting white on miniatures, white's a very difficult color to use, and the reason why is because it's a very transparent color. Any kind of color that you have underneath it will easily bleed through, and that's why white is such a frustrating color to use in most cases. And it makes it even doubly horrible because in white line, especially in high elf armies, white is a very predominant color. So in order to hack this, what I usually like to use pale gray by Folk Art by creating a base coat of that by putting two thin layers on the parts that I want to be white. That way, when I put white paint on top of the pale gray, it just accentuates the white. The opaqueness of the pale gray also covers up any rogue color quite easily and makes it very simple to paint. So I just put two thin layers of pale gray on the entirety of the white lion. We're ready to move on to our next step. And that next step, of course, is to paint the white lion. And I use just white by Apple Barrel paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. And I put two thin coats of this directly on top of the pale gray that we did earlier. And as you can see, it does a better job of actually making sure that we don't have to worry about those colors bleeding through the transparency of the white. That pale white kind of makes pale gray makes a nice solid base coat to work off of, and it makes the white paint job even brighter. And next step, of course, is to work on the sun that's on the banner as well as all the gold elements. And unfortunately, I forgot to take a picture of me actually painting that sun yellow. I do apologize for that. I used King's Gold by Apple Barrel paint in order to do so. I did that for the sun motif. And then, of course, I used Deco Art's Emperor's Gold, which is a nice, rich golden color, to do the gold elements. So I did the trim of the flag, as it shows right there on the flag. And I also did a little ruin there on the white line itself. I put two thin layers of that Emperor's Gold to do that. And the banner is done. And so now the banner is finished, we can start focusing on the rest of the army. Alright, so the very first detail we're going to work on are the metallic elements. Now you might be thinking, Commander Cheapskate, usually don't you wait till the end of the metallic elements? I usually do, but the reason why I started the metallic elements this time around is because the chainmail coats, the fish scale coats that high elf armies wear, they have like this really thin layer of color that goes around the edge of all their armor pieces. It's a very frustrating detail to paint, but it looks amazing when you do it correctly. Like I said before, I struggle with making straight lines and doing edge highlighting when I'm painting, so it's a very difficult detail for me. And that's why I don't want to ever paint high elves ever again, but unfortunately, I guess I'm a glutton for punishment, and so therefore I'm painting up more high elf miniatures. So when it comes to armor, like I said, I want these guys to look like they came from the woodland, so I wanted a metallic color that would blend in better with the environment. And I thought our bronze would actually be a nice color to use because it kind of complements the earth tones that these guys would be traveling through, and is not as revealing or shiny as silver, for example. So because I use Agent Anti-Copper by Anita's Acrylics, you get this at your local Hobby Lobby. I put two thin coats on all the chainmail and fish scale that's exposed on these miniatures. So these are mainly the skirts for the newer miniatures. On the older miniatures, they usually have them on the skirts as well, but also on their sleeves of their hauberks. And once we get done with that, next detail we got to work on is on the trim of their armor. And like I said before, you got this nice little line of color that goes around their armor, which is very frustrating to paint on both the newer as well as the older miniatures. So for that detail, I use Holly Branch by Apple Barrel Paint. And the reason why is because, as I mentioned before, we're going to use green as the accent color for this regiment to make it look like they kind of blend in with the woods. So I just did two thin layers of that Holly Branch along the trim of their armor just to create that additional detail. And it looks actually quite quite nice. If you do make a mistake, just neaten up with some copper paint in case it gets into the, sorry, not copper paint, some bronze paint in case it gets into the armor, or if it gets onto the clothing, don't worry, we'll neaten that up when we get to the white painting stage of these miniatures. So up next, we're now going to paint the silver elements on these miniatures, and I broke them down between the pewter miniatures as well as the newer miniatures to kind of show you guys the differences in the sculpts. So for these guys, for example, these are the old Marauder sculpts from the 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy. So I painted their helmets, I painted the blades of their axes, as well as the arm greaves, as well as the lave greaves that these guys have. So just put 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art, which you get your local Walmart for that. I did the same thing with the 6th edition miniatures as well. I painted their helmets as well as their leg greaves and arm greaves, as well as the blades of their axes as well. And for the newer plastic miniatures, we did exactly the same thing. We did the blades of their axes, their helmets, as well as their forearm greaves, as well as their leg greaves as well as the breastplates these characters are wearing. Because unlike the older sculpts, the breastplates are not exposed, but these ones they are. So that's the reason why I picked out that detail, as well as the crown of the little lion head that's on the top of the standard bearer. And this is why I painted the metallic elements first, because we got to do the cloaks. The cloaks are, of course, the most exaggerated detail on these miniatures. Is the one that people catch the eyes on the most. Now when they're wearing these pelts, of course, they do have the leather interior, so to create that leather interior look that looks like the hide has been cured and tanned, I decided to use Nutmeg Brown by Apple Paint. It's a beautiful mid-range flesh tone color I like to use for a lot of the mid-range flesh tones for the miniatures I paint. It's got kind of like a reddish brown complexion to it, which looks really nice like tan leather. I just put down 2 thin coats on the interior of their coats, and we're ready to move on to the plastic miniatures. And as you can see, I did exactly the same detail for the plastic miniatures as well. So with those 2 thin coats of Nutmeg Brown down, we're ready to move on to our dry brush. So for that part that we did earlier, Nutmeg Brown, I decided to dry brush that with Flesh by Apple Paint. That way it casts a nice little contrast to the elf flesh. It's very dark compared to the elves, and at the same time looks like tan leather as well. And I do exactly the same thing with the plastic miniatures as well. And now that we're done with that detail, we can start moving on to their white lion cloaks. Now when it comes to actual white lions, in real life, white lions are actually not pure white like the traditional white color. They're actually more like a beige, kind of paler, kind of cream color. So to create that same illusion on these guys, because white's such a horrible color to paint on these miniatures, I decided to actually do a solid base coat of khaki. I used 2 thin coats of khaki by Apple Paints. So these are the old pewter sculpts that we were talking about earlier. Just do 2 thin coats on the outside of those pelts. And I do exactly the same thing with the miniatures that are done in plastic as well. As you can see, I painted their back cloaks as well as the top of the standard bearer. Now to neaten up the brightness of these cloaks to make them look more of like a paler color for these guys, I decided to use successive layers or dry brushing. I use Ivory by Apple Paint to dry brush the khaki color to bring it up to a nice bright standard. I then add another dry brush on top of the khaki, just using traditional white by Apple Paint, and as you can see, it's brought those cloaks up to a nice pale, kind of creamy, kind of beige looking color for these white line cloaks I'm wearing. As you see, I do exactly the same thing with these guys as well. So these guys all have khaki colored cloaks. I then dry brush them real quick with some Ivory. And for the additional brightness, I also dry brush them one more time in white by Apple Paint as well. So the next detail we're going to work on these characters are on the handles of their axes. Now a lot of people like to use like this pale kind of bone color for a lot of high elf weapons, but I decided to stick with dark wood colors. And the reason why is because these guys are supposed to be frontiersmen, they're supposed to be woodsmen, so why mess around with their equipment? Why not make them look like what they're supposed to be, like lumberjacks and woodsmen, that sort of thing. So because I decided to put the handles of their axes in 2 thin layers of burnt umber by Apple Paint, you can at your local Walmart. And I use exactly the same colors for my white lions that are done in plastic that we did earlier. Just put 2 thin layers of that burnt umber and ready to move on. And of course, we're going to dry brush those axe handles to bring out those details like the fine wood grain that was sculpted in them. So these pewter miniatures anyway. So we're going to use some Territorial Beige by Apple Paint. Just do a once over roll fast with the dry brushing on those handles. And we're going to do exactly the same dry brushing with Territorial Beige on the plastic miniatures that we had done earlier. So next thing we're going to work on is on the hair on these miniatures. Now for the plastic miniatures, the hair of the miniatures are actually not exposed at all except for the unit champions. So we're going to primarily focus on the pewter miniatures for these ones. So for 4 of these miniatures, I paint up their hair in 2 thin layers of King's Gold. For 3 of these miniatures, I use pavement paint by Apple Barrel Paint. For 2 of these miniatures, I use ripe tomato by Apple Barrel Paint to kind of make them look like they have like this orangish auburn kind of color. And for like the last 3 fighters, I use moccasin brown by Adidas acrylic, which you can get at Hobby Lobby at your local Hobby Lobby. Just put 2 thin coats directly onto these characters and we're ready to move on. And I mentioned before, the only character that has any hair, of course, is the unit champion for the plastic miniatures, so I painted this guy in 2 thin layers of King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint as well. And as for the hair for this character, I also dry brushed it in ivory as well. And to be perfectly honest, if you're wondering, Commander Cheapskate, did you dry brush the hair of the other white lions? For the pewter ones, the answer is no. To be honest, I completely forgot about dry brushing them, so I do apologize for that. But then again, I'm also not a professional painter. I'm also not a professional YouTuber either. I'm just a hobbyist. So next detail we're going to paint on these miniatures real quick are on the claws and teeth of the white lion cloaks these characters are wearing. So for the claws, it's pretty simple. We just use 2 thin layers of pavement paint by Apple Barrel Paint on these guys. Now, as for the old Marauder style miniatures, they actually have the teeth exposed from the heads of the white lions on their cloak. So that one's going to be a little bit different. So as you can see, I zoomed in real close on the heads of the white lions for 2 of these sculpts. One's on this one guy's shoulder, the other one is on the back of the head as well. And the reason why I decided to do a close-up on that is because I decided to paint the entire mouth in 2 thin layers of pavement paint. And the reason why is because when you look at the mouths of lions as well as tigers, if you look at their lips, they actually have black colored lips and their gums are kind of a blackish color as well. So I decided to paint the entirety of their mouth in that pavement paint, so I can go back and neaten up by bringing out the teeth using different colors for that. I did that for both of the characters who have lion heads on their cloaks. I then decided to dry brush the claws and the teeth that we had earlier on those cloaks. I did it with the quick dry brushing real quick because I'm pale gray, so that it brings out those details. And lastly, I decided to paint the teeth of, you can see right there in the background, I decided to paint the teeth of the lions with the Hazy Moon by Folk Art, which you can also get at your local Hobby Lobby as well. It's kind of a creamy, kind of antique white, but it looks kind of nice when you compare that and contrast it with the gums that we did for these white lions earlier. And of course, I forgot to take a picture of this as well. I do apologize, but I did exactly the same thing with the base coating and pavement as well as a dry brush with pale gray for the claws of the white lion cloaks of the plastic miniatures as well. So the next detail we're going to work on these miniatures real quick are on the green elements on these guys. So we did the holly branch earlier for things like the trim of the armor, which we already taken care of. But now what we're doing things is we're focusing on things like on their belts, for example, scabbards of weapons that they're carrying, the plumes on the top of their helmets, as well as the plumes on hanging off their axes. Like I said, what made these look like these guys are actually from the woodland, so I put 2 thin coats of holly branch, which is a nice rich green color to give them that accent color. Now, as for the plastic miniatures, I did exactly the same thing. Plumes on their weapons as well as their helmets, also belts that they had on their armor panels as well. Also, if you look on the back of their cloaks, they have like a little bit of a hood hanging off the back of their cloaks as well. So to bring out that detail, I just kind of trimmed that real fast with some holly branch as well. Now the next thing we're going to do, of course, is we're going to dry brush all the plumes and the green that we did earlier. We're going to use lime sherbet in order to do that. So just a quick dry brushing directly on all the plumes, as well as the tabards, as well as the head wrappings for all the pewter miniatures. And I use the exact same color for the high elf miniatures that we did in the plastic ones as well. So with that step done, we're now going to work on the gold elements on these miniatures. And there's actually quite a bit of it. So these guys actually have armbands around some of the older pewter miniatures as well. Same thing with some of the helmets that they have. They have like these decorations of phoenixes as well as like spikes, strips of color. I also did the same thing with some of the runes that are located on the arm as well as the leg greaves of these older pewter miniatures as well. And on the newer plastic miniatures, things I focus on were, for example, around the helms, for example, the bits of jewelry that they have, around the arm wraps that they have around their arms. They also did some things like some iconography, some jewelry on both the lion cloaks as well as on their persons. And same thing with some of the charms are hanging off of their wrists, their ankles, and also on their back, as well as the crown of the white lion on the standard bearer. And specifically for the pewter miniatures, the plastic miniatures as well, I forgot to show this earlier. I do apologize for this, but I actually painted their shoulder. They actually have a pauldron with a lion's head on it, and if you notice, I painted that actually before I did the rest of the gold miniatures. So I do apologize for that. But what I decided to do is paint out those pauldrons in gold, and I decided to dry brush them with some anniversary silver by Folk Art. Now it's a very bright silver with a little bit of blue tinge to it, and the reason why I did that is because I want to make that shoulder panel kind of, be extra vibrant to kind of signify the fact these guys are the bodyguards of Phoenix Kings. And one of the last few details we have left are on the gemstones, and since a lot of the turquoise, I use Bimini Blue by Apple Barrel Paint because it's a nice contrasting color for all the greens as well as the golds as well as the silvers that we have, and at the same time it's a very eye-catching little detail. So look for all the gemstones on these miniatures, and there's quite a bit of them, so I just put 2 little thin dots of Bimini Blue on that detail, and I go back to the plastic miniatures. For the plastic miniatures, I use Bimini Blue for all the jewelry that we see on all the gemstones that these guys have on their armor. I also use Folk Art's Mystic Turquoise. That's a nice darker turquoise color. I use that to pick out the eyes of the lion on the standard bearer. And the very last step before we move on anywhere else, we start working on the white color for these characters. So, like I said before, white's a very painful color to paint on high elf miniatures, just because white's a very transparent color, so if you make any mistakes, you have to go back and fix that up. Now this part, I actually use this as a touch-up phase for the very last step, because all we're really doing is we're looking for any spots where we might have some color kind of get onto the white clothing. Things like the sleeves of their shirts, as well as the bottoms of their tunics. And if I do find that problem, I first put a layer of pale gray on top of that first, and then I add white on top of that by Apple Barrel Paint, so that way that opaque pale gray color covers up the color, and that way just the white kind of bleeds through. And I use that for both the pewter miniatures as well as the plastic miniatures in the back. And with that, the very last step is to do an oil wash. So a lot of people like to use Arm Painter Strong Tone in order to do this step, but we're going to skip that because Arm Painter Strong Tone costs $32 a can, whereas a can of mid-wax polyacrylic and mission note color does exactly the same thing at a fraction of the price. Now, you will have to dilute your mid-wax paint when you add this onto your miniature, so I will tell you guys that right off the bat. There's a variety of ways you can do this. The easiest way is just to use white spirit is all I used. That's all I used. To take some white spirit, thin it down a little bit, and make it more like a very pale kind of sepia kind of color with your mid-wax poly shades. You're going to put more mineral spirit than you actually do mid-wax in order to make it, because you just don't want to overpower the white on these miniatures. Okay, so that's the reason why we're doing that. So it's going to make it more of like a rich white color, but not too dark, which that's what you really want to go for. And then once you get that color, you're going to paint that over the entirety of the miniature. And the reason why is because the oil wash does a couple things. The first thing it does, of course, is that it seeps directly into the recesses of the miniature, and it darkens those recesses by bringing out those details we couldn't see before. Things like the individual granules of hair located in the plumes of their helmets. Same thing with the lion cloaks. It also goes in the space and the gaps of the armor panels, as well as the finer details. The other thing it also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our base coats and our dry brushes and makes them kind of blend together. And the last thing it does, of course, is it darkens down the value of our colors. Now, not too significantly this time around, because we did thin out the mid-wax polyacrylic with some white spirits in order to do that, but as you can see, it does a beautiful job of bringing those colors together. It also brings it down a little bit. Now, you will need to let it cure and dry for about 24 hours because there is polyurethane in it, which is going to give you a nice protective layer for your miniatures. And once you're done with that, move on to your next step. And that step, of course, is on the bases. So we're going to use English Ivy Green by Apple Barrel Paint to paint the entirety of the texturing on the bases. Now I'm going to give these guys an old school Warhammer, like heavy metal from the 1990s look, just because I like that goblin green look they had originally from the 90s, because that's what I grew up with. And plus my army already has that color anyways, so that's what we're going to do. And we're going to do exactly the same thing with the plastic miniatures. We're going to paint the bases with 2 thin layers of English Ivy Green. If you guys notice in the background, I do have my army's battle standard bearer as well as my army's dragon. And the reason why is because I'm touching up the bases on these miniatures. I'm also touching up the details on the standard bearer as well. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to dry brush the bases with some lime sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint as well. We're just going to do a quick dry brushing over all the parts that we did in English Ivy Green to bring out those individual grains of sand to make it look like it's grass that these guys are walking on. And we're going to do exactly the same thing for the plastic miniatures that we did earlier, just using that lime sherbet in order to bring out those textures. And our last detail real quick is to rim the bases. We're going to put 2 thin base coats of Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel Paint. Just do 2 quick coats of that directly on the rims of the base to bring that beautiful old school green looking base. And we're going to do exactly the same thing to the new plastic miniatures as well. And with that being said, that pretty much finishes up our miniatures. Now the very last tip, of course, is to do a matte varnish spray all over these miniatures. I don't like that high gloss look at the end, so I like to make mine have like a little bit more of a matte varnish. So I use Krylon matte varnish, and I get my local Walmart to do that. Now if you don't like that, of course, you can skip that step. It's completely optional. So here we guys are with our end result, and as you can see, we brought these miniatures up to a beautiful tabletop standard. I've combined both the pewter miniatures as well as the plastic miniatures to make a massive unit of 35 white lions of Chrace, and as you can see, it's very hard to tell apart which ones are which. They look really good together. At the same time, it's a beautiful tabletop standard. These guys look like they're coming out of the woods to fight you and to chop down any fool who is dumb or stupid enough to try to attack the Phoenix King of Ulthuan. And assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time for a cheapskate method, you're talking about a grand total investment of $48.80 in the materials that we use to paint up our miniatures. So that being said, let's talk about the materials you need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did by using those name brand paints instead. So these are the materials you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel in order to paint your miniatures up the same way we did, but using the name brand paints instead. You need to buy a can of Corax white spray for $24 to create your primer. You also need to buy the colors Baharoth Blue, Averland Sunset, Militaran Green, Vulcan Green, Longbeard Gray, White Scar, Caliban Green, Cyberite Green, Bugman's Glow, Caning Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Hellion Green, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Troll Slayer Orange, Flayed One Flesh, XV88, Ulthuan Gray, and Wraithbone and McCrag Blue, and all those colors would cost you $4.55 in order to purchase those each. You also need to buy a can of Wildwood, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Ironbreaker, Croxapore Blue, as well as Retributor Armor, and all those colors would cost you $7.80 for those colors. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, a can of Minotaurian Varnish for $24 if you wanted to achieve the matte varnish for your miniatures. And if you're not going to use sand from outside, you'll need to buy Army Painter basing set, which would cost $18.99 for those. And if you want to magnetize your miniatures, you got to buy a Army Painter miniature magnets. That's going to cost you $13.25 for those. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything for Army Painter as well as Citadel for the very first time, we're talking about a grand total investment of $254.59. And when you subtract our cheapskate total of $48.80, you end up with a grand total savings of $205.79. So there you guys have it. If you're looking to save money on your miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to some cheaper craft paints and materials in order to paint up your miniatures. After all, you'll achieve similar results at a fraction of the cost, and that you can use that money that you save to buy more miniatures or to save it, or no spend at all. It's entirely up to you. So there you guys have it. That's good for this video. I am Commander Cheapskate. Please be free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. I will catch you guys next video. Peace out and stay classy.